Phoebe, it's so good to be sitting across the virtual table from you.
Yes.
I remember when your series on Darryl Hunt came out way back in the day, 20 years ago almost, and how fabulous it was. And I thought that I have kept abreast with Darryl. I've seen him over the years at different times, but reading this book is just remarkable. The depth and the background and the compassion you bring to this is really something. So my first question for you is, who was Darryl Hunt, and why is his story so important?
Yeah, I love that question. So Daryl was a young man from Winston-Salem. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
He was a young man from Winston-Salem, North Carolina, who grew up admiring his grandfather, and he was orphaned at quite a young age. And what he really wanted to do was work for the city streets department the way his grandfather had, and lead what he talked about early in his life. He just wanted to lead a decent life. He wanted to get married, he wanted a lot of kids, and he wanted to lead a decent life. And instead, he was railroaded at the age of 19. He was arrested for a crime that he hadn't even heard of when he was first questioned. It was the brutal rape and murder of a young white copy editor at the afternoon newspaper. And he was wrongly convicted. He was then railroaded in a second crime that had happened earlier. So he was wrongly convicted a second time. He spent 19 years in prison fighting his wrongful conviction, and he got out when the crime was finally solved in 2003 with a DNA match against the database of convicted offenders. And he went on to become an eloquent and a really important advocate for social justice in North Carolina. Many reforms that have come about in our justice system are due largely to him. He also worked for men and women coming out of prison on their reentry, and he became a really remarkable person. But he didn't ever get the chance to really live the life that he had dreamed of for himself. Instead, all of that was taken from him, and he died. He died 6 years ago, kind of around now. His body was found on March 13th, 2016. He died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound, and he had been dead for several days. So we are on the 6th anniversary of his death right around now.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about what role or how much of a factor in Darryl Hunt's experience with the criminal justice system involved race?
Yes. So, in one way, it's everything. And in one way, of course, people who are white have been wrongly convicted too. So the problems that his case exposed affect people regardless of your race. But in his case, the injustice he faced had everything to do with race. So first of all, this idea, this mythology and this fear we have in our culture of Black men as sexual predators. So that myth goes back to the very beginning of our culture, of our country's founding, right? And it was used to perpetuate slavery. It was used to perpetuate Jim Crow, and it persists today. This idea that we have that Black men are violent, and I really think that from the moment he was arrested, his conviction was inevitable. So he had very able representation at his first trial and dedicated representation. By the time his second trial came around, he had some of the best attorneys in the state and in the country representing him. But really, there was almost no way to be acquitted young Black man accused of raping a white woman. And then the system is really set up against Black defendants. So he was convicted there was only one Black juror at his first trial. It's very easy for prosecutors to strike jurors from potential jurors from the jury. At his second trial, the case was moved to a rural county, so there was no chance of getting any Black jurors to hear his case. And then after that, our system is set up for finality. So this white defendants face this as well as Black defendants, but it was really clear that bias among judges helped keep him in prison. So when the North Carolina Supreme Court heard his appeal in 1994, and by then there was DNA evidence that showed that he was not the rapist in the case, the court still ruled against him, and the justice who wrote the dissenting opinion was a Black justice, and he wrote about how the DNA evidence in the rape was essential to understanding that crime. He understood what that meant, and the other justices did not. So really, I think race had everything to do with it.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder, in a way, how much did science have to do with it? Because, as you just said, in 1994, the DNA showed that it was not his semen in the rape kit,
right?
And that all the accounts, witnesses who allegedly saw or did not see what happened that horrible morning, that there was a single Black man who was seen with Deborah Sykes, right?
Yes.
And so, and if it's not his DNA, I was wondering, could you talk about, instead of accepting the science, what prosecutors and judges did from that point forward?
Yeah. So, I mean, I want to talk about two things in answer to your question. I hope I don't forget the other, but first of all, I think in this case, racism and racial bias trumps science. I mean, it should have been obvious from 1994 that at the very least he deserved a new trial. It should have been obvious that a jury would have considered the DNA evidence that showed it was not his semen compelling evidence in a murder trial. But instead, the courts came up with these explanations that were more and more ludicrous. So they came up with alternate theories of the crime that, well, Darryl could have killed her, but not raped her. But then all the other suspects also tested, their DNA testing also excluded them as the rapists. So then they came up with these theories that talked about how Hunt could have raped her, but not to be crude, but maybe he didn't ejaculate. So it just became more and more ludicrous. So racism, I think, played a huge role, but also our system is simply set up for finality, and finality is often more important than reaching a just conclusion. The idea that we've just got to close the case and move on. And also the hurdles for introducing new evidence, even exculpatory DNA evidence, are very high. So innocence is not a claim in court. New evidence is a claim. And then the hurdle is that you have to persuade a judge that the jury would have reached a different conclusion in considering the new evidence. And it just was too high a bar for Darryl's attorneys to meet.
So science is pretty strong in this case. pretty
Science
final.
was really strong. And in fact, science was strong in this case even before there was DNA evidence, and they had these other ludicrous explanations. So before we had DNA, we had blood typing, right? And you
Right.
could test semen. Semen has the same blood typing markers as blood, A, B, O, and one other, I forget what it is.
AB.
And thank you. And the Daryl's blood type didn't match the blood type of the semen. So they came up with this unscientific explanation that the victim's blood type, that there was some sort of mixing of the blood types, and that her blood type had masked his blood type, which wasn't even science at the time, but it passed as science at his first trial. But I forgot your question. It had to do with science,
Well,
DNA science.
I have another question about that's related to all this. That's so one of the most powerful parts of the book for me, and it's on page 214, and it involves a woman named Regina Lane. And I was wondering if you could tell us who Regina Lane is, what was her experience, and what did we come to learn from her?
Yes. So this will take a few minutes to set up that passage that you're talking about, but the crime that Darryl was wrongly convicted in happened in August of 1984. And in February of 1985, before Darryl even went to trial, so he'd been arrested, but he was still sitting in jail awaiting trial, another young woman on her way to work in downtown Winston-Salem, across the street from the newspaper office and a block away from where Deborah Sykes was raped and murdered, a young woman was kidnapped and taken to another part of Winston-Salem, to an abandoned drive-in movie theater, and raped and stabbed multiple times. By a miracle, she mustered enough strength to wrestle the knife away from her attacker, and she escaped and survived. And she asked very early on if there could be a similarity between her attack and the rape and murder of Deborah Sykes. And she also identified her attacker in a lineup very early on. But when she asked about the similarities between the two attacks, the police told her, oh no, they couldn't be similar because the man who had raped Deborah Sykes was in jail awaiting trial. And they even told her that they didn't want to mess up that case. And then along the way, she was discouraged from pressing charges. They made it seem as though it would be her word against the word of the man she identified as having attacked her. And it wasn't until the DNA in Hunt's case, in the Sykes case, was matched against an attacker, and that crime was solved, it turned out to, in fact, be the same person. The same man attacked this woman in February 1985, as had attacked and killed Deborah Sykes. So, but none of this really came out until Darryl Hunt was exonerated, and the city began to investigated what had gone wrong with the investigation that led to his wrongful conviction. And the woman in the second attack was a woman named Regina Lane, and I can name her because she's spoken very publicly about what happened to her. And when this happened, she was a woman who believed that the police would do right by her. And she believed that maybe she was wrong, maybe she'd gotten the wrong man. And it really was not until they reinvestigated, found that Willard Brown, who she had identified, had even come to their attention in the Sykes murder. And it wasn't until she saw all that and even saw pictures of Deborah Sykes's crime scene pictures, and could see that she had been stabbed, even in the very same way that Regina Lane had been stabbed. It wasn't until then that she came to realize that she had essentially been sacrificed and that she had been denied justice so that the case against Darryl Hunt could move forward. So that was a long setup, and I will now find that passage and read it. And what happened to her is what finally gave Darryl Hunt the chance to file a lawsuit against the city and win a settlement, because it was the way she'd been mistreated that really proved that Darryl Hunt's wrongful conviction was not an accident or just a muddled up police investigation, but that there'd been some intent there. So I can read now. Does that sound good?
Sounds great.
Okay. So she had the chance to speak to a task force that was looking at what had gone wrong with Darryl Hunt's case. And I'll read now. So this is Regina Lane. And she's ready to testify. She wasn't nervous. She had prayed about this moment and felt the strength of the Lord. My name is Regina, and 21 years ago tomorrow, I was labeled by the Winston-Salem Journal as the Intergon victim. For far too long, she allowed the police to speak for her. Quote, "It is time for me to speak." At 18, Lane had trusted the authorities, but now she knew better. For many people listening, the key moment in her testimony came when she described the very first inquiry she made 2 days after the attack about the possible connection between her case and the Sykes murder. Quote, "Detective Miller walked away again, and when he returned, he said in a very firm voice his answer. They already had the man or man that raped and killed Deborah Sykes in jail. Detective Miller told me that, quote, they didn't want to do anything that would make people ask questions or put doubts in people's minds because it could hurt the case against the people in jail." It was the first admission anyone listening had heard of a police officer's intent to protect the case against Hunt. When tact and diplomacy failed, there's always trickery and deceit. When she was done speaking, the room fell silent.
It's really remarkable that that's happened just a couple days before Darryl Hunt went on trial, and the police were more interested in protecting their case against Hunt than in protecting the public and protecting her.
Yes, it's extraordinary. And I just want to emphasize what you just said, but more interested in prosecuting Hunt than in protecting the public and in protecting this young woman who had nearly been killed.
Right. One of the things that struck me about Darryl is that he could have been a poster child for wrongful conviction, and he was. But when he finally got out of prison after 20 years, he did not choose that as his mission. His mission was to work on welcoming people leaving prison back in society.
Yes.
Why was that? And talk a little bit about that.
Yes. So, yeah, when he got out of prison, people really wanted him to work on wrongful conviction and lobby against the death penalty. And he did all of that. But he really, as you said, wanted to work with people coming home from prison. And I think it was because from his earliest days in prison, even though he knew he was innocent and he knew he was in this terrible place for no good reason at all. He didn't see himself as different from the other people who were there with him. He didn't see himself as somehow or other superior or apart from them. He saw this wretched place where he was as a place where they didn't really belong either. And I saw that in some of his writing. So in researching the book, I had access to this incredible archive of papers that his attorney, Mark Rabel, donated to the law school library at Wake Forest. And it includes correspondence and other between Darryl Hunt and his attorneys. And it also includes diaries that Darryl Hunt wrote while he was in prison, and then a kind of oral history that he was recording when he got out. And if you can bear with me, I'd like to read just a couple of things that I found that shows just the way he thought about himself and the other inmates who were in prison with him. So this is from early in his time in prison, I think in 1985, and he was in one of the worst prisons in the state. It was a place called Blanche, which is in Caswell County. And Blanche was known as North Carolina's little Alcatraz, referencing the prison in San Francisco. So it was all concrete, very secure. And it was one of the prisons in the 80s, they separated young men from other men. So it was one of two prisons that was for men ages around 18 into their early 20s. And another thing to remember about Caswell County is that Caswell County for a long time and is still sort of a bastion for the Ku Klux Klan. So imagine prisons generally hire from the surrounding area. So you can imagine what it would have been like to be a Black inmate in Klan country when you were convicted of raping a white woman, wrongly convicted. And so this is what he wrote. He wrote, quote, "How they treat us. I know some of the brothers here have done their crimes, but that doesn't mean they have to be treated like dogs. Each person here is a human being and deserves to be treated like one. But if a person can imagine what hell is like, he can imagine what I am going through right now. I know it's about 98 degrees in this cell. We have no cold water. The water that comes out is so hot and nasty." So there, I was just really struck by his sense that this was no place for anyone. And then I heard the same sense it would have been around 10 years later. By then he'd been twice convicted, and he was trying to appeal those convictions. And at this point he was in a prison in Eastern North Carolina. I don't know if you've ever visited there for any reason, called Caledonia. It was a prison farm. So a lot of people have heard about Angola and Louisiana, or Parchment in Mississippi, which are infamous for being built on the sites of old plantations. And we have one of these prisons in North Carolina. So, we were talking earlier about the connection between racism and the life that Darryl endured. Well, it's not theory anymore when you go to Caledonia to talk about prison and our carceral state as a legacy of slavery, because there it is. And when Darryl was in Caledonia in the 90s, he worked, I think, in the laundry, but they were still using imprisoned men to work the fields, and they were still guarding them on horseback with rifles. So they'd bring people out into the fields. Right now they grow crops and they raise chickens there. They used to raise cattle. It's used to provide food for all the other prisons in North Carolina. And So one of the things Daryl was involved with when he was in prison, now he was a Muslim, and so that gave him some stature. And he was also beginning to do activism on behalf of people in prison. And one of the inmates had either a heart attack or a convulsion, something happened, and the guards weren't bringing in medics or providing any help for him. And the inmates tried to give CPR and the guards prevented that. And this man ended up dying. And then Daryl led a kind of petition drive to try to investigate what this cover up was about. And so this is what he wrote at the time. He wrote, "Life is precious to everyone, regardless of a person's present circumstances, and any chance to save a life should be allowed and not hindered by sickness, such as race, creed, color, not a childish mentality of being an inmate." And this is the point that I really want to emphasize. God did not create inmates. He created human beings with hearts of love, regardless of a person's status in life. So when he got out of prison, he carried these experiences with him, and he really saw how prison damaged anyone in prison. And he really believed that anyone, regardless of whether they committed the crime that they had served their sentence on, deserved a chance to have a better life and a chance to have this kind of decent life that Daryl always wanted for himself. What he also understood was, regardless of how much one-on-one advocating that he did and mentoring and helping people get jobs, he also understood that this system is really designed to make this homecoming nearly impossible. So people now talk about this idea of a civil death, but there are thousands of rules, regulations, licensing requirements, hiring practices, all kinds of barriers in place that make the work that Daryl was trying to do and to make the homecoming for people nearly impossible. I think that gets at what you were asking.
And does that seems to get at the subtitle of your book?
Yes.
The life sentence of Darryl Hunt. Can you elaborate just a little more on that?
Yeah, I can, and I'm going to do something really logistics for 1 second. It's getting dark out, and I forgot to turn the light on in my office, and I think I need to do that. I apologize for that pause, but I didn't want to go dark here. Yeah, so in 2007, Daryl gave an interview with the NPR station in Durham, and he was talking about this work that he was doing, but also talking about the near impossibility of the challenge that people he was trying to help faced. And he talked about this idea that regardless of your sentence, any kind of criminal record, especially a felony record, is really a life sentence. And that's where the subtitle of the book came from, this idea that that a criminal conviction dogs you for the rest of your life. And he said something really beautiful during that interview. He said, "I pray for all the people I left in prison and hope that they too one day will be free."
So was Daryl ever free?
I think he had, moments of freedom, and it looked like he was free. So he was married in prison, but he had a house and a family and work, and he traveled, and he had a truck, and he had the trappings of freedom. But I don't think he ever really found a way to free himself from, from the trauma that he endured and from the injustice that he suffered. And that's one of the subjects that I'm really exploring in the book, which is not just the trauma of being in prison and being subjected to the kinds of life violence and death threats that he faced, but also the trauma of being falsely arrested and convicted of something that you know you didn't do. It's like your whole world comes undone. He to get through these moments, he had this habit of fixating his gaze on something. And when he was arrested in September of 1984, in the warrants office in Winston-Salem, I've never seen this, but they had a cell in the warrants office that essentially was a cage. And since this was such a high profile crime, they invited reporters in to see them arrest Darryl Hunt. And so they put him in this cage, and all these reporters showed up, and he didn't want to fall apart in front of all these people. And so he fixed his gaze on the socks one of the reporters was wearing. The socks were lime green. And years later, he and his attorney, Mark Rabel, were in Washington, D.C. for a screening of the documentary they were in, and for a panel. This was part of Daryl's work as an activist. And they were sitting in the hotel lobby, and it was, I suppose, had some, funky decor with all these neon lights everywhere. And one of the lights was lime green. And Mark Rabel looked over at Daryl, and he'd broken into like this cold sweat and was having a full out panic attack. And when he was able to regain his composure, Mark Rabel asked him, what happened? And he said, see that light over there? That was the color of the reporter's socks that I fixed my gaze on. So I don't believe he was ever diagnosed with PTSD, but he was having symptoms, and that has to do with trauma and the way these experiences live on and are inescapable. So I don't think he never had a way to free himself of the burden he carried.
Mhm. And once he got out, so there's all the trauma that accumulates, and you describe it really well in the book, the layers of trauma that accumulate over the years in prison. And then once he got out, there was, I imagine, many different pressures on him. I know that many exonerated people, especially ones who get settlements, some people don't view them as a human. They kind of view them as an ATM.
Yes.
As this person got a lot of money in a settlement. So
yes. Yeah, you wrote about that heartbreaking case of the two brothers who were swindled out of their settlement, right? So yeah, so Darryl, there were all these pressures on Darryl. So the first part of the pressure, I think, was, and we do this as a culture to people. We expect people to behave, people who are heroic, we expect them to behave heroic always. So he had these really high expectations that he felt that he had to meet. And then he got a big settlement. He got $700,000 from the state and $1.5 million from the city. And so everybody he knew that he had money. And he knew a lot of people who didn't have any money. And it got to the point for him where wherever he went, he couldn't even go to, his wife told me about this, he couldn't even go to the Food Lion to get a carton of milk without somebody asking him for money. And he gave away a lot of money, but I think that really, really hurt him, that people he thought were his friends, he no longer felt that he could trust. And I think that was really, really painful for him, and felt like a betrayal. The other thing that happened to him is, he felt that he wanted to do this advocacy work, and it gave him a sense of purpose. And a lot of people who are exonerated go on to do this kind of advocacy work. But what it meant was that to be a successful advocate, he was retelling his traumatic life story over and over and over again. And it's clear that early on, it stopped being cathartic and turned into an experience that was re-traumatizing. So, for example, his wife told me that they would go to these screenings of the film that would be done to raise money or to do advocacy work. And it got to the point where he could no longer watch this documentary about his life, and because it was just too painful. And so they would have a screening. He wouldn't go to the theater until the last 5 minutes, and then he'd show up for the panel discussion.
Wow. And there, you and near the end of the book, you had this phrase that prison triggered a double life for Daryl Hunt.
Yes.
And that is really painful to read after, or just that whole idea.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So one of the things that I found is that Daryl's public face, or his public image, really from the time he was a 19-year-old teenager, he kept this kind of calm demeanor. And after he was exonerated, he never expressed rage and he never expressed rancor. And it was a really beautiful thing to see, except that inside he was pissed as hell. And even his journals from early on are filled with anger and rage, but he also couldn't project any of that in prison. You can't project weakness in prison. And so, and then when he came out, he couldn't, he felt, he could have, but he felt that he couldn't project fury or rage or resentment. So he, from my sense of what his life was like, is that he kept all these normal human emotions concealed, and he had this public life and then a private life that was filled with anguish that he didn't really share.
I'm curious whether, given how horribly he was treated by our criminal legal system, did anyone in a position of authority ever admit error and say, "Oh boy, we got it wrong. We got it big wrong," or even just say sorry?
Yeah. Well, the judge at his exoneration hearing acknowledged error, although I'm also a writing teacher, so it was strange to me, even though he was responsible for Daryl's exoneration, he expressed it in the passive voice, which was a very strange way to do it. And after that, as far as I know, nobody has apologized or admitted error, but I don't know what happened, if anybody did so privately to Daryl. But I think the more important question is that the prosecutors were never held accountable. The city, to some extent, individual police officers were not held accountable, but the city did pay a handsome settlement. So that was in our civil arena, that's a way of holding government to account. But the prosecutors were not held accountable, except perhaps the first prosecutor in the case, who lost his bid for re-election because he couldn't win the Democratic primary without Black voters, and he lost support of Black voters because of Hunt's case. But after that, the prosecutors were not held accountable, and neither were any of the judges who ruled incorrectly.
Yeah.
And I don't know what we do about that.
Well, for police, there's always the question of qualified immunity and getting rid of
Mhm.
that. And for prosecutors, there's the discussion on, prosecutors have absolute immunity for whatever they do in the courtroom,
Yes.
inside the courthouse. And uh, given that um, former the Nuremberg prosecutor and former U.S. Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson, said that there's no one more powerful in your community than the prosecutor, in a famous 1942 speech to the American Bar Association, that a person or an individual with that much power in that position holds absolute immunity.
Mm-hmm. It's frightening. And of course, in Darryl Hunt's case, he was prosecuted by people who really didn't believe that I don't think they believed he was guilty. They've never said that, but the first prosecutor in the case was complaining privately to the police chief that the case that he'd been given was crap, and he still went after the death penalty. And the prosecutor in the second case, who recently retired from the Attorney General's office in North Carolina, before Darryl's second trial, he'd offered him a plea deal for time served. So he was going to give a man he was prosecuting for raping and stabbing a woman to death 19 times. He offered him the chance to plead guilty after serving 6 years in prison, which is an extraordinary plea offer considering the crime. And none of them were ever held accountable.
The plea deal would have let him walk out that day.
It would have let him walk out that day, and he turned it down. And everybody advising him, except for one minister, John Mendez in Winston-Salem, who wanted him to follow his conscience. Everybody else advising him said, take the plea. This could be over, take it. And he refused to take it.
And I love that line that you include of his response to Larry Little in the car, why he wouldn't take it.
Oh, I don't remember the line, but I can look it up.
Yeah. It was something, where is it?
He said, Larry, if I take the deal, how are you going to explain to people that you raised all this money for me? And then he said, Larry, Allah would not forgive me for bearing false witness. And Larry Little, who was the founder of his defense committee and then a city councilman and is now a professor at Winston-Salem State, he said, Allah is not going to do this effing time. You're going to do this time. And Darryl just said, Larry, I can't do it.
Yeah, well, I think that gives an insight into his spirit when he says, I can't bear false witness.
Yes.
I can't lie. And I have to tell you, and I'm not lying, if I was in his shoes, I would rather walk out the door, admit to something I didn't do, than spend another 10 years of the rest of my life in prison.
I'm quite certain that I would take a plea. I don't, even if it was to spend just another year in prison, I don't think I would turn down that deal.
Yeah. So
he had a tremendous amount of integrity.
Yeah. You've spent a lot of time with Darryl over the years, and he spoke to your class, and you interviewed him. And I'm just wondering, what's one of your favorite moments or memories of him?
Oh, that's a really good question. So I think that my favorite memory, and of course I didn't know him at all in the way I've come to know him writing this book and talking to his friends and really learning about who he was. And it's a sad book, but I have learned that he was a lot of fun and that he had a great laugh and was a little bit of a prankster. And I've learned things about him that I didn't know. But I think my favorite memory of him is our sons, well, his stepson and my son went to the same elementary school. And I used to walk my son to school with the dog, and Daryl would take his stepson to school, drive him to school. And when he got out of prison, he had this bright blue, I think it was a Ford truck, but it was really bright, like sapphire blue. And I would just see, I would be crossing the street and he'd be coming down the hill in his truck. And it had a, he'd wave and I'd wave, and it had this very happy sort of free feel to it that I did know at the time about his desire for a quote, a decent life and a simple life. And it sort of felt like, it feels like a moment where, yeah, he had what he wanted, except now I know that he really didn't completely, but there he was with his truck and his stepson doing this normal thing like we all get to do.
I think we have a guest coming on.
Well, yes, you do. Well, hello.
Okay.
Hello, Patricia.
Hi, I wanted to jump in for just a few minutes, if I may, to see if we might be able to pose some questions from the audience. Phoebe, does that sound all right?
That sounds great.
Okay. So we have a question from Earl Smith, and the question is, did your Winston-Salem Journal series have anything to do with getting Mr. Hunt out of prison and eventually exonerated?
Yes, thank you, Earl, for posing that question. Yes. So one of the things that the series did was, well, first of all, I didn't get a chance to actually solve the case, but what we did do was we were able to tell the story in a way that made it very accessible for people. So lots of people in Winston-Salem who thought they knew the case against Darryl Hunt were able to see it in a new way and able to see how weak the evidence was against him. And that, I think, changed the way the judge who had ordered the DNA testing saw the case, and it led him to threaten to hold the state crime lab in contempt of court because they were not doing the testing that he had ordered. They were just sitting on his court order. They'd been sitting on it for 7 or 8 months by the time my series came out. It led the district attorney to see the case in a new way, so that when the DNA match finally happened, he was more open to dropping the charges against Hunt. But it also led, I think, to the match. So what the story of how the police and the crime lab finally arrived at this match is very convoluted. But we talked about Regina Lane earlier in this conversation. So after the series, the first day of the series ran, I had a message on my voicemail from this woman. She had this really raspy voice, and she said, "I know Darryl Hunt is innocent. Please call me. You have to call me." And I called her, and the first thing she said was, "I want to tell you something, but you can't tell my daughter-in-law that I called." And then she told me all about the second rape and how she was sure it was the same man, but that the police had bullied her daughter-in-law into not pursuing it. And so I didn't have enough time to really explore this other rape, but I did make some inquiries and I wrote about it in the last day of the series. And most significantly, I had the name of the man that the daughter-in-law had identified. So I had Willard Brown's name. And when they finally ran the testing, they got a partial match to Willard Brown's brother. And a partial match is normally meaningless. And it would have been very easy to just drop that, but they pursued it and they found they went to another crime lab, and that crime lab said, this is so close that you really should look at this man's brother. And so they pulled up the partial matches brothers, and they found Willard Brown's name, and they found that Willard Brown was in jail on a probation violation, and they had no grounds to get a court order to get a sample of his saliva, but they gave him a cigarette. It was just out of, a TV show. They gave him a cigarette, he flicked it on the floor, they picked up the butt, they tested it, they got their perfect match. And I don't know that the police would have pursued it if Regina's mother-in-law had not called me, and if they didn't know that I knew Willard Brown's name, and that at that point then Hunt's defense attorneys had his name, which they've been trying to get for 20 years, but were unable to get because of this cover-up that we've already talked about.
One of the statements that you make in your book is, and I'm just going to read from it here, that often the members agree, you're talking about city council. Black aldermen supported naming the local Coliseum after Black Vietnam War hero. You're talking, and then the white alderman did not. You're discussing the kind of the racial composition and the dividing lines in Winston-Salem. How do you see that now with a bit more distance? Has anything changed? Are things still the same?
Oh, that's a great question. So that was all a discussion of what was happening with local politics in the 80s. So I suppose my thoughts on that aren't so specific to Winston-Salem as they are to our country. And we're still a country divided by race, and we saw it play out in our last presidential election. We see it playing out in all this fight we're having about congressional redistricting. We saw it play out in the storming of the Capitol January 6th. So I think that some of the racism that was so apparent in Winston-Salem in the 80s, and that Daryl Hunt suffered, and all the use of the N-word and all of that comes up in the book. I think maybe it displayed itself more crassly then, but it feels still very much present, not just in Winston-Salem, but throughout our country.
We have a question from Rosemary. Was Daryl offered mental health assistance on release, and is there anything that could be changed or implemented to make that a standard for exonerated prisoners?
Yes, that's a great question. So I know that a few people close to him encouraged him to get counseling, and he tried it, but didn't stick with it. But as a standard of care for people coming out of prison after exoneration, absolutely. People who've gone through these experiences that Daryl Hunt went through need mental health services, and very few, there's just not money in these innocence projects. Run on a shoestring. Many of them run out of law schools and depend on law students to do the work. some states don't even give compensation to people coming out of prison after being exonerated. And so the whole innocence movement is really just in the past couple of years beginning to even turn its attention to thinking about what to do about the trauma people have faced. And we just reached a kind of grim milestone. There's an organization called the National Registry of Exonerations that tracks wrongful convictions, proven wrongful convictions, and they just posted number 3,000. So there have been 3,000 men and women wrongly convicted in this country dating back to 1989, and they absolutely need mental health services. They probably need a kind of treatment that is not widely available. I mean, how to deal with trauma is a different level of treatment than how to deal with, you know, the kind of depression, you know, the kind of ordinary mental health services that, you know, I get or that the rest of us get.
Well, we're at the top of the hour, so I want to honor your time and the time of our audience. And thank you, first and foremost, Phoebe Zerwick, for Beyond Innocence, the life sentence of Darryl Hunt. And you've been in conversation with Joseph Neff of the Marshall Project. Phoebe, is there anything else you'd like to close on this evening before we go?
Yeah, I suppose what I really hope is that this book opens up conversations like the one we've been having tonight about these really difficult topics in a way that is accessible to people. And I think it's accessible because Darryl Hunt was such a remarkable person, and the people around him were really remarkable people, and they were brave, and they stuck with him, and they fought for his release. And I think the story is a story that's both tragic, but is a story of resilience and some heroism.
Well, I want to thank you for being here, Phoebe Zerwick, and conversation with Joseph Neff. Phoebe's book is Beyond Innocence, the life sentence of Darryl Hunt. Thank you all for joining us this evening.